You expect rain when you think of Oregon, the slow, silver drizzle that makes the firs sag and the rivers rise, the steady hush of the coast where gulls will like punctuation marks over slate water. But if you come looking for only wet weather in modern towns, you'll miss the other Oregon, the one that sits beneath the moss and the map dots, the landscape stitched with strange monuments and invisible highways of stone that do not belong to our comfortable timeline. There are places in this state where the fog seems to remember names, where boulders stand like punctuation marks for stories we cannot fully read. We promise to take you there, not as tourists but as witnesses, to walk quiet paths, to stand at the margins of what we think we know and watch the boundary line tremble. By the end of this hour, and of the nights that come after you close your screen and the glow fades, you will carry questions that ache. You will want to know how knots of human agency, geology, and myth braided together into things that science can measure, and history cannot always explain. You will find artifacts that point to long corridors of trade, carvings that refuse tidy interpretation, and landscapes that insist on their own timelines. We will walk through precise dates when they matter, we will measure and recount, but we will also lean into imagination, because some mysteries demand that you picture yourself there, boots half buried in peat, breath steaming, the world around you made stranger by silence. This is a documentary in words, an invitation and a provocation. We are confident in the facts we can verify and humbly curious about those we cannot. As we go, hold two things at once, healthy skepticism and an openness to wonder. There is value in both. The histories of places are often written in fragments. Our task is to reconstruct, to narrate, and sometimes more importantly, to admit where the fragments refuse to be fully stitched together. Keep that refusal in mind as a kind of clue, that something still resists our tidy maps because it belongs just as much to the realm of the uncanny as it does to the laboratory. Picture a rain-washed trail at dawn. The mist clings to the blackberried brambles like a memory. There is a stone upon which 50 years of rain have made an odd sheen, and on that stone someone once engraved marks that look suspiciously like a script that should not be here. We will tell you about those marks. We will tell you why they excite professional archaeologists, why they rouse skeptical geologists, and why, in quiet moments, they make us imagine lost voyagers, giants, and tribes who kept secrets like household keys. We will hold up radiocarbon dates and ship manifests, village plans and whispered legends, and we will ask you to imagine the consequences if even one of the stranger hypotheses were true. But here's where it gets tricky. Hypotheses are not verdicts. They are attempts to rough out a shape from the negative space left by time. Still, for all the evidence, some questions remain obstinately open. We will stop before we overclaim. We will tell you what we know, what we suspect, and why another generation of tools or a different kind of eye might tip the balance. Now, let's be fair, some of these possibilities are fanciful. Giants, lost tribes, ancient transoceanic voyagers, these make for good headlines and for excellent running hypotheses until archaeology and rigorous testing either bend them into plausible form or render them into myth. But to dismiss the mythic elements out of hand is to miss a kind of testimony. Stories themselves are artifacts. They are social molecules that bind communities and outlast specific events. Listening to them is part of the evidence. So we will weave together measured science and oral memory, geology and lore, and we will leave the final judgment to you. Picture yourself walking a foggy trail at dawn, imagining the weight of the world before roads and GPS. Imagine the hush after a storm, the small drum of raindrops on old timber, and the sudden, unnerving clarity of a straight line of stones that should not be straight where they lie. Imagine standing with a trowel, lifting peat, and revealing a bone with a shape that does not match the species recorded in field guides. Imagine radio silence on your phone because the place is deliberately off-grid in more ways than one. These are the sorts of scenes we will visit. We will also measure, date, and argue. The stories that follow are not drama for drama's sake. They are attempts to narrate puzzles that real people have catalogued, sometimes for centuries. What binds these places together is not a single conspiratorial thread but a cluster of features, sites that predate reliable colonial records, physical remains that contradict easy classification, artifacts that imply contact or exchange across long distances, and landscapes that carry the fingerprints of human intention on a scale that suggests complex societies, sometimes very ancient ones, left sophisticated traces. Each mystery we present will end with an open question, not because the evidence is thin, but precisely because it is stubbornly abundant and ambivalent. That is where the drama hides, in the materials that point in two directions at once. Our first stop is a place on the windward flank of the Coast Range where straight lines and megaliths resist the simple story of random boulder scattering. Our second will take us to a plateau where charcoal samples give us dates that frustrate conventional timelines. We will visit carved stones, sunken settlements, and a tidal burial shore whose bones speak of travel and violence and careful ritual. In every case we will use precise dates and measured artifacts to anchor our telling, but we will also ask you to imagine a wood-smoked dusk, a lantern swung by a reaching hand, and a shadow that looks like an outline of something no one alive can name. We still do not know how to reconcile all these elements. The work of science continues, new techniques emerge. But that work also relies on storytellers to care enough about silence to try to make sound from it. So stay with us. We will move from the solid to the speculative and back again, and through those moves we will try to make sense of Oregon in the mode that suits it best, not as a single neat narrative, but as a layered palimpsest, weathered, rewritten, and lived over again. Picture that palimpsest under your feet. Imagine brushing away the top layer and revealing handwriting 100 hands old. Imagine how thrilling and unsettling that would feel. That is the promise of these next hours, big revelations, measured doubt, and the pleasure of watching the earth keep its secrets just long enough to invite us to dig. It begins at a place called the Stone Rows of the Coast, a name locals use in shorthand for a system of linear stone alignments tucked into the low forested hills above a tidal inlet. The teaser is simple, a series of unnaturally straight rock lines on a landscape dominated elsewhere by chaotic glacial deposits. Archaeologists first noted the lines in the early 20th century, but only in the 1970s did systematic surveyors map them, recording runs of granite and basalt blocks forming alignments stretching over 200 meters with remarkable regularity. Radiocarbon samples from associated hearths returned calibrated dates clustering between 1200 and 800 BP, roughly 800 to 1200 years ago, a period when the indigenous populations of the Coast Range were dynamic and widely networked. These alignments are not merely piles of rocks. Some blocks show pecking and grinding marks consistent with deliberate shaping. Nearby middens contain shell, fragmented obsidian, and worked bone that suggests this was a place of sustained, recurrent activity. One of the most intriguing pieces of data is the presence of obsidian artifacts traced through elemental analysis to sources more than 300 kilometers inland, a sign of trade routes or exchange networks that run contrary to any expectation of purely local material economies. But here's where it gets tricky. The geometry of the rows implies planning and coordination on a scale that modern surveys have had difficulty reconciling with the settlement densities inferred from other sites dated to the same period. Some scholars propose that the rows functioned as navigational markers tied to seasonal salmon runs, aligning with sight lines to known tidal channels used by fishers. Another theory suggests a ritual corridor, perhaps for processions associated with winter ceremonial cycles, while geologists caution that certain freeze-thaw cycles and post-glacial slope processes can, in rare circumstances, produce linear stone distributions that mimic human arrangement. Still, for all the evidence, the shaped stones, the hearths, the midden contents, the exact purpose remains ambiguous. Imagine yourself walking one of these lines at dawn, the sky low and the ground wet beneath your boots, the stones rising in regular succession like vertebrae. Picture the patience it would take to drag and set each block, the social organization implicit in such labor. Picture a procession of people, drums held at their ribs, moving between the trees on a cold morning, and ask yourself why that image sits so comfortably in the mind when confronted with the silence of the stones. We still don't know whether these rows were route markers, ritual spaces, or the remains of a landscape-scale engineering project whose goal we have yet to comprehend. The ambiguity is not a failure of imagination but an invitation to imagine differently. 100 miles inland, on a plateau rimmed by basalt and old river terraces, is a place where carbon dates and settlement patterns refuse to line up neatly, the Sunken village of the High Valley. The teaser here is a strand of house pits and wooden post holes submerged beneath peat and silt, their preserved timbers returning dates that push established chronologies in unexpected directions. Excavations in the 1990s revealed a cluster of semi-subterranean structures, post molds every few meters indicating houses of substantial size, storage pits with charred corn and camas bulbs, and a layer of packed clay that suggests purposeful floor construction. Radiocarbon assays performed on charred timbers return calibrated results centering around 2,800 to 3,200 years BP, a time window older than expected for such architectural complexity in this region. Companion finds included finely flaked points and a surprising number of worked bone beads bearing styles seen in coastal contexts, implying either coastal influence or long-distance exchange. One of the most striking discoveries was a mass of compacted peat that, when peeled back, revealed a set of unusually large post molds, stones set for posts that imply taller than average house frames or even communal structures. Now, let's be fair. Preservation biases in peat bogs can make some places look older than they are because organic layers accumulate in ways that confound continuous occupation models. Yet dendrochronological cross-dating on several posts gave ring patterns consistent with the early dates, corroborating the radiocarbon work. The competing theories are numerous. Some archaeologists argue for the independent emergence of relatively complex architecture among inland groups much earlier than textbooks assumed. Others suggest episodic maritime influence brought inland during particular seasons, varying ideas and techniques across the valleys. A more provocative hypothesis posits that the plateau was a refuge following climatic stress, a temporary concentration of people who built more permanent structures in response to an emergency, and then dispersed. Mythic retellings in the oral histories of neighboring tribes speak of houses that sank to the earth after a great shaking, a phrase that may metaphorically encode flood or earthquake memory. Imagine yourself at the edge of the peat, stepping carefully as the sun breaks through a high morning fog, the smell of wet earth and cedar rising up. Imagine lifting a plank to reveal dark, oily peat and beneath it a carbonized beam. It rings a map of droughts and good years long before our calendars. There is an eerie intimacy to holding a blackened plank that last felt a hand 3,000 years ago. Still, for all the wood and dates and trade hints, the reasons for the unusual architecture and its apparent sudden burial remain contested. We still don't know whether this was an early, independent architectural tradition, a response to sharp climatic variation, or a scene of a social drama that left more questions than answers. Along the jagged coast, in an estuary where tides dig deep and the shore is a palimpsest of human and animal life, is the low, salt-etched plain known locally as the Burial Flats. The teaser here, a recurring pattern of human bone, deliberately positioned, but found amid fauna and artifacts that suggest unexpected mobility and strange funerary practices. Surveys shot through the last century reported only sporadic finds, but a concentrated excavation early this century revealed burial features containing skeletal remains showing non-local isotopic signatures. The bones themselves are notable. Several specimens display perimortem cut marks consistent with defleshing or complex mortuary manipulation, while others show signs of careful interment with shells and finely worked ornaments. Strontium isotope analysis from dental enamel indicates early life residence in geologies hundreds of miles away, implying either long-distance childhood movement or the presence of people who had traveled across dramatic ecological zones. One of the more sensational, and contested, claims involves the discovery of unusually large femoral fragments whose measurements, if taken at face value, suggest individuals over 7 feet in stature. Skeptics point out that fragmentary measurement can mislead, that post-depositional distortion and differential preservation can create illusions of size. Yet local legends, recorded by ethnographers in the 19th century, speak of shining banks and tall white men who appear in certain tidal seasons, phrasing ripe for interpretation but impossible to read as literal history without care. Among the competing theories are ideas of coastal mobility, groups with wide-ranging seasonal circuits burying people near favored tidal flats, ritualized reburial practices that involve secondary processing of bodies before final interment, and explanations grounded in trade and exchange, people moving with marriage alliances, captives, or ceremonial deputations. There is also a line of thought that environmental upheaval, tsunami or sea level changes, reshaped living patterns and forced unusual mortuary responses. Picture yourself kneeling in cold mud, the gulls a sound like loose chain, carefully prying away a layer of silt from a bead necklace and signaling to the field notes how the inclusion of certain shell species implies a summer season of death. Picture the ache in a scientist's voice when she says, with a mixture of pride and discomfort, that the isotope data points to childhoods spent far away. That ache is also a human recognition of dislocation. We still don't know whether these burials document far-reaching marriage networks, displaced communities after a catastrophe, or a ritual practice whose logic has not survived in ways we can decode. In a high, fog-wrapped canyon where basalt cliffs throw back sound like an answering drum, there is a rock face carved with low, shallow grooves and cupules that appear to form a map of sorts. A map that might predate printed maps and yet encode astronomical alignments too precise to ignore. The teaser, a petroglyph panel whose patterns bear uncanny correlation to solar and lunar cycles, and which sits near a terrace system that suggests intentional agricultural modification. Scholars who have studied the canyon's carvings note a set of concentric circles, paired with drilled hollows and abraded lines that, when plotted, correspond to solstitial sight lines visible from specific vantage points on the terrace ridges. Charcoal in the terrace soil has yielded dates clustering around 1600 to 1900 BP, consistent with a period of intensified landscape management, perhaps associated with proto-agricultural intensification. Companion finds include grinding stones and seed impressions in compacted mud that suggest sustained plant processing. The astronomical hypothesis is compelling. Alignments like these could have functioned as calendars, coordinating planting and ceremonial cycles with celestial events. But geology complicates the matter. Small-scale thermal expansion and long-term abrasion can create depressions that mimic intentional cupules, and weathering can accentuate natural patterns into apparent symbols. There are also multiple mythic dimensions recorded by indigenous elders. The circles have been described in stories as the listening stones, or the plates of the world. Metaphors that could both metaphorically refer to cosmology and literally to carved tools. Imagine standing on a terrace at dusk as a gentle wind pushes fog through the canyon, the rocks cool under your palm, and you feel, for a moment, an institutional calm in the arrangement, a sense that the stones were placed to teach, to remind, to coordinate. Imagine a community pacing the terrace on a cold morning, one person marking the sun's thin sliver against a notch, and another recording the date by scraping the notch with a bone tool. That quotidian humanness is easy to forget when we leap to grander, more sensational claims. Still, for all the geometry and the clear evidence of landscape work, the precise function of the panels, calendar, map, teaching tool, or something else, remains unresolved. We still don't know whether the grooves encoded purely practical agricultural timekeeping, a layered cosmology, or a lost mnemonic device whose rules we cannot confidently reconstruct. On a remote riverside bench sits what has come to be called the trading stone, a boulder of basalt pocked with smoothing from hands and yet hosting an improbable concentration of exotic materials nearby. The teaser, a single place that seems to gather goods from multiple bioregions in numbers that suggest a specialized exchange hub. Excavations found beads made from marine shells alongside flakes of obsidian chemically traced to at least 3 distinct inland sources and carved bone implements stylistically akin to artifacts found closer to the Columbia River corridor. The stratigraphy shows concentrated deposits over a relatively short period, and pollen analysis indicates a sudden, localized intensification of certain plant types, possibly brought for trade. One theory posits this bench as a seasonal rendezvous point where inland and coastal groups met to trade goods, ceremonial items, and marriage alliances. Another, more controversial hypothesis imagines an organized institution, a proto-marketplace regulated by social norms and perhaps even religious oversight, functioning as a node in a wide network. Critics caution against projecting modern economic categories onto ancient behavior. Exchange in many indigenous contexts is embedded in kinship and ritual obligations rather than loose capitalist markets. Yet the densities of exotic materials here are hard to explain away as chance. Imagine placing your palm on a stone that once served as a counting table, the grooves induced by repeated handling, numbering systems mapped into knotted cords or bead piles. Picture traders walking from diverse ecologies, high plateau, temperate rain forest, tidal estuary, and laying down goods on the bench as a ritual of reciprocity. Picture the language games, the sign exchanges, the shared songs that would travel with the goods. There is an emotional intimacy to imagining that level of social complexity because it reveals how people coordinate across distance without modern transport. Still, for all the material evidence, the degree of formalization, whether this was a loose seasonal meeting or something with institutionalized rules, remains in dispute. We still don't know whether the trading stone marks an emergent market, a ritualized exchange place, or an ephemeral concentration of social traffic driven by climatic or social upheaval. Further inland, under a canopy of old growth that smells like sap and salt from distant seas, there lies a stone circle whose dimensions and settings suggest intentional astronomical and social use. Local oral histories reference a ring of watching stones, where elders would read the sun's path and adjudicate disputes. When modern researchers surveyed the ring, they recorded a circumference nearly matching systems of measurement found at other distant sites, and they noted that one of the stones bears a carved motif rarely seen elsewhere in the region, a stylized human form with exaggerated limb proportions. Excavations around the circle turned up concentrated charcoal, carved wooden items preserved under anaerobic soil patches, and curiously, a collection of small stone spheres whose manufacture implies a high degree of skill. The sphere's mineral composition includes a rare greenstone whose nearest source is dozens of miles away, suggesting purposeful transport. Some interpret the circle as an observatory for tracking the movements of Venus and tracking ceremonial cycles oriented around that planet's appearances. Others see in the carved human motif an ancestral figure, perhaps even a totemic representation of a founding ancestor, which would give the circle a social as well as astronomical role. Mythic accounts collected in oral tradition tell of a tall one, who taught the people how to make spheres that hold the world's memory, an evocative line that could refer metaphorically to memory devices or literally to objects of prestige. Imagine sitting in that ring as the dusk deepens, as the stars wheel into place, feeling the stones cool beneath your hands. Imagine the hush as a group marks a planet's rising and uses it to set time and memory. When the material evidence and the stories overlap, we have the richest, most combustible kind of mystery, scientific data that seems to echo a living memory, either fully reducible to the other. We still don't know whether the circle functioned primarily as a precise astronomical instrument, a social gathering place with layered meanings, or a hybrid institution that combined calculation, law, and ritual. Each of these sites, the Stone Rose, the Sunken Village, the Burial Flats, the Petroglyph Panel, the Trading Stone, and the Watching Circle, presents us with measurements, dates, and artifacts that make plausible multiple stories. Sometimes the stories compete, and sometimes they complement. There are other places we could visit, shell mounds that rise like small hills to the casual eye but contain stratified records of diet, climate, and trade. Cloistered caves with charcoal drawings that hint at animal forms absent from the region today, and shorelines where deep-time sea level changes have buried earlier occupations so thoroughly that we only find their edges. Across all these sites the themes recur: mobility and exchange, ritual and memory, technical competence and social coordination, surprising dates that push back our expectations, and a persistent layer of myth that refuses to be dismissed as mere fiction. Yet for all these convergences, the mysteries stand because each new piece of data can complicate rather than resolve the picture. That is not failure, it is the honest shape of historical inquiry. We will return to each place in more detail, to look carefully at the data, the competing theories, and the human stories that both complicate and illuminate them. For now, remember the feel of cold stone under the palm, the sound of wind in trees, the way fog can make a small hill seem like an island. Keep an image in your mind of people doing ordinary things, cooking, trading, grieving, whose traces we try to read centuries later. And keep a second image in your mind, the things we cannot yet read, the arrangements that suggest organization without a clear match in our comparative datasets. Those are the haunting things, the ones that will pull at you from the next sections, because they ask us to reckon with a past that is both familiar and alien, a human past that insists on its complexity. We still don't know the final answers, but we can begin to ask better questions. The stone rose returned to us as a kind of stubborn question. How do you explain a straight line where chaos seems the more natural order? Picture again that coastal hillside where firs lean into the wind and the earth smells like iron and salt. Imagine that among the scatter of glacial erratics and root-exposed cobbles you suddenly find a succession of stones set in an alignment so regular that your eye expects to find a ruler laid beside them. Some are native granite, some basalt. A few show chisel marks so faint you could miss them without patient light. The runs stretch, in places, for 200 meters or more, with intervening gaps whose geometry is almost modular, as if the builders knew to place a stone every certain number of paces. During the first methodical mapping in the 1970s, surveyors used tape and theodolite and radio, and they reported anomalies, alignments broken by gullies, sections shifted by later erosion, but the underlying straightness persisted. Radiocarbon dates from hearths deliberately sampled in association with the rows clustered in a range roughly between 1,200 and 800 years before present, placing them broadly in a time of dynamic coastal societies, when people fished, traded, made canoe journeys, and hosted seasonal gatherings. Those hearths yielded charred herring bones and camas residue, and midden deposits alongside the alignments included flakes of obsidian with geochemical signatures traceable to multiple inland sources some hundreds of kilometers away. The obsidian is the kind of fingerprint we can trust. Its trace element composition is as diagnostic as DNA. That tells us people came here with trade connections or traveled long distances themselves. But the geometry, the long, linear arrangements, implies planning. Think for a moment what that planning would require. Communal decisions about placement, labor organized around moving tens or hundreds of heavy stones, and the social capital to keep such work meaningful across seasons, perhaps across generations. Now, let's be fair, geology sometimes plays tricks. Slope processes, frost heaves, and gravity can preferentially move similar-sized stones into pseudo-alignments. A careful geologist will politely insist on that possibility, and it must be considered. But when you couple geological caution with evidence of deliberate shaping, peck marks consistent with human stone tools, and with associated cultural material like hearths and shell middens, the argument for human agency grows stronger. One hypothesis, and a persuasive one, argues these rows functioned as navigational markers, a linear language that indicated safe paths through dense coastal scrub to particular tidal channels during the fog-thick months. It is easy to picture. In low visibility, a series of stones arranged in repeated intervals could serve as a reliable tactile guide, something you could follow by touch or sight between stunted shore pines. Another hypothesis reads the rows as ritual corridors. In many cultures, linear ceremonial spaces structure processions, seasonal pilgrimages, and initiation walks. The choreographed passage between stones imposes rhythm and order on a community's movement through time and memory. If the rows marked such processions, the arrangement of stones would be as much about performance as about geography. A third, more structural hypothesis imagines the lines as part of a landscape engineering scheme, perhaps delineating property, hunting grounds, or seasonal territories in a region where dense forest and fog obscure conventional boundaries. Each of these notions has traction, because each finds echoes in the material data. But here's where it gets tricky. None of these scenarios cleanly accounts for every datum. The obsidian points to long-distance connections that imply exchange networks and social linkages beyond the narrow function of simple path markers. The hearth complexes and midden concentrations suggest repeated, perhaps extended occupation nearby, as if these were not merely transient navigational aids but the focal points of communal activity. Then there are the oral histories collected by ethnographers in the early 20th century. Elders sometimes referred to the way of the stones as both place name and verb, a phrase that could suggest ceremony, travel, and law at once. Mythic motifs recorded in these accounts, mentions of lines that guide the dead, or Stitches in the land complicate but also enrich the archaeological reading. Do the rows guide the living, the dead, or both? Imagine walking the alignment at dawn, the fog an actor in the scene whose presence both hides and reveals. Imagine a procession moving between the stones, children's feet catching light on wet stone, elders carrying baskets of food or tokens. Each creative image must be checked against the data, yet the images themselves are evidence of possibility. They help us picture how a community might have used the lines. Then there is the labor component. Moving multi-hundred-pound stones is not done casually. A project involving dozens of such stones implies organized labor, leadership, and a cultural rationale sufficient to motivate people. Was the rationale practical, aesthetic, political, sacred? Maybe it was all of these. Some researchers point to the alignment's sightlines towards certain tidal channels and stellar risings as proof of dual purpose, practical orientation tied into cosmological observation. This would not be unusual. Many cultures fold the pragmatic and the sacred together. Still, for all these interpretive options, we find ourselves facing a core mystery. The rows are at once ordinary, stones set in lines, and utterly peculiar when you consider the scale of coordination implied and the multiple kinds of evidence that cluster around them. We still don't know whether they were primarily navigational tools for mariners and fishers, ceremonial corridors anchoring social rites, territorial markers that formalized seasonal land use, or an integrative feature that served multiple overlapping social needs across time. That ambiguity is not a flaw but the very texture of historical life. Social practices often do many things at once. Move inland with me now to the High Valley Plateau, where peat has preserved timber, and where the soil holds a story of habitation that stubbornly predates our neat timelines. Here the sunken village reveals its beams and post holes like the bones of a submerged animal, blackened with age yet startlingly intact. The houses were semi-subterranean, their floor levels scooped below the general ground level and lined with compacted clay. Large post molds, round, dark stains in the peat, indicate timber posts of substantial diameter, some taller and more robust than we expect in contemporaneous structures elsewhere along the inland coastal transect. Radiocarbon dates from several charred timbers, corroborated by dendrochronological sequences on at least 2 posts, point to occupation episodes centering roughly between 2,800 and 3,200 years before present. That range is disquieting for archaeologists, because the material complexity here, planned houses, storage pits suggesting surplus management, and finely worked bone ornaments, suggests social and economic organization earlier than commonly modeled for the region. If these dates are correct, we must revisit assumptions about when certain architectural forms and social arrangements emerged. One explanatory path argues for local innovation. Perhaps groups living in the ecological niche of the plateau adapted to a suite of pressures, resource seasonality, population density, intergroup competition, that incentivized larger and more permanent architecture earlier than on the coast. Another account looks to interaction. The presence of coastal-style beads and other artifacts with typological echoes of coastal material culture could indicate seasonal or trade ties that brought new building ideas inland. Yet a third, more dramatic hypothesis considers environmental shock. Some evidence indicates abrupt sediment deposition events in the area, a rapid burial or a waterlogged burial episode, which might point to flood, seismic disturbance, or climatic oscillation prompting communities to build more robust, consolidated dwellings in response to unpredictable conditions. Think of the human dynamic at play. Communities tend to consolidate technical knowledge and social practice when circumstances reward greater coordination. A drought, a predator surge, or shifting migratory patterns of staple foods could all create pressures that favor investment in heavier architecture and stored surplus. Mythic memories help, too. Neighboring oral traditions speak of a great bed, where houses were laid into the earth, after a shaking that made valleys drink their own rivers. This could metaphorically encode seismic events or flood memory. It could also be ritual cosmology reinterpreted as environmental narrative. Imagine, just for a moment, standing at the edge of a peat layer and lifting back a dark, greasy plank to reveal a beam whose rings tell a story of drought years and bountiful ones, of cold summers and mild winters. dendrochronology can, with surprising specificity, match ring-width patterns to regional climatic sequences, and in this site such matches suggest episodic climatic stress during the time of occupation. If people here built thicker, more communal houses in response to hardship, what does that tell us about social organization? It suggests leadership capable of marshalling labor, distribution networks for stored food, and possibly ritual practices oriented around survival. But let us be cautious. Peat preservation complicates our models. Peat accumulates unevenly. It can bury and preserve earlier activity while later intervals leave little trace. That means the sunken village could be an artifactually rich moment in a longer continuum, or an episodic concentration during a crisis. Either way, the human heart of the matter is the same. People adapted, innovated, shared practices across distance, and sometimes left behind buildings constructed with a care and permanence that shocks modern expectations. We still don't know whether the village represents an early indigenous architectural tradition that developed in place, a transfer of ideas from coastal neighbors prompting early complexity, or an emergent refuge formed in response to abrupt environmental events. The evidence supports multiple readings, and that is precisely what makes this site both fascinating and humbling. As we wash our hands of peat and move toward a tidal estuary where bones sleep in salt, the burial flats demand a different kind of attention. The estuarine environment is a preservative and a disturber. Tides bring new layers, storms rearrange strata, and yet dark anaerobic pockets can lock organic matter in time. Burials were found both primary and secondary. Some skeletons lay in coherent positions with grave goods, others appeared as disarticulated remains, worked and processed in ways suggestive of complex funerary practice. The isotopic signatures from teeth and bones are particularly illuminating. Many of the individuals buried here have strontium and oxygen isotope ratios that point to childhoods spent in geologies and climates markedly different from the estuary itself, upland river valleys, basalt ranges, even farther-flung ecological zones. That implies either life histories that include long-distance movement or social processes such as marriage alliances, adoption, or capture that relocate people across great distances. Perhaps most sensationally, fragmentary long bone measurements initially suggested the presence of very large individuals, leading to speculative headlines about giants in the flats. Skeptical osteologists patiently corrected the record, noting that post-depositional compression and incomplete elements can easily mislead size estimates. Still, the combination of unusual burial processing, including deliberate cut marks on bones consistent with secondary defleshing or disarticulation, and the diversity of isotopic origins creates a picture of a community entangled in broad networks of movement and ritual complexity. Competing theories range from socially normative practices, such as excarnation followed by secondary burial at favored communal sites, to explanations involving forced displacement after conflict, to ritualized adoption of outsiders during periods of alliance formation. Environmental hypotheses are also considered. A tsunami or sea level rise could displace communities, producing mass mortality and complex reburial scenarios as survivors reorganize life and death. Picture kneeling in gray mud, the gull calls overhead like a rough chorus, brushing away silt from a bead necklace whose shells came from far up coast, and thinking of the human story. This was a person who, in life, traversed zones we can only approximate through isotopes, and in death was placed where tidal waters could remember them. The ethical dimension is not trivial. Archaeologists here have to balance scientific curiosity with respect for descendant communities and their wishes about reburial and study. That intersection of science and memory underscores a central lesson. We cannot read bones without listening to living voices. Oral traditions here sometimes frame the burial flats as a crossroads for wayfarers, a place where the living leave messages for those who travel between worlds. The notion of the shore as boundary, physical, social, cosmological, is centuries old. We still don't know whether these burials document wide-ranging mobility due to marriage and kinship networks, violent displacements tied to resource conflict or climatic upheaval, or ritual practices that transformed bones into social objects relocated across landscapes. Across these landscapes, the tension between what we measure and what we imagine is a continual companion. We can date charcoal with a precision that would have astonished earlier generations. We can analyze elements in stone and trace trade routes. Yet the most stubborn truths, why a community decided to lay stones in a line, why they built larger houses at a particular moment, why they buried certain relatives beside a tidal flat, remain partly in the domain of human motive, which resists the full forensic gaze. The best science does not pretend otherwise. It multiplies lines of evidence, soil micromorphology, isotopic mapping, obsidian sourcing, dendrochronology, ethnography, oral histories, and experimental archaeology. Put together, these lines produce a richly textured but non-final narrative. In the end, what holds is not a single answer but a constellation of plausible human actions, small and large, repeated and reinterpreted across centuries. That plurality is not merely an academic inconvenience, it is an honest reflection of how communities lived. Human life is messy, layered, and designed to be read at several registers at once. So we keep measuring and testing and listening. Imagine, once more, standing on that coastal row at dawn, the fog a membranous veil that does not entirely conceal nor reveal. Imagine feeling the cold of the stone under your palm and recognizing, in the rhythm of its placement, something like a language of effort and care. Imagine lifting a blackened beam from peat, reading ring after ring that maps years of drought and wet. Imagine brushing silt from a grave and, for a long suspended moment, thinking you can hear the laughter of people who once walked that place. That suspended moment is the philosopher's hinge. It is where we balance evidence and empathy, skepticism and wonder. The mysteries are not holes to be filled with myth, nor are they puzzles to be solved purely by algorithmic rigor. They are, instead, invitations to hold complex things together, to imagine, test, and listen. We still don't know the full stories of the Stone Rose, the Sunken Village, or the Burial Flats. But each new analysis, each carefully sought oral testimony, each patient excavation adds another stitch to a garment we will wear imperfectly and perhaps more richly for the attempt. The Cascades hold a different kind of mystery, pockets of light in a dark, coniferous ocean, places where quartz glitters like teeth picked out from the earth. On ridge crests and in hidden saddles, local hunters and hikers sometimes stumble upon low cairns, deliberate stacks of milky quartz and sun-bleached stone, arranged in curious clusters that resist casual explanation. The teaser is simple: small monuments made of a stone more symbolic than utilitarian, placed in settings that suggest intentional sight lines and social choreography. Archaeological teams first catalogued these quartz concentrations sporadically through the late 20th century, but a systematic survey in the 2000s mapped clusters across dozens of ridgelines, some isolated and some forming rough networks visible on careful topographic overlays. What makes the cairns striking is not their size. Most are modest, a few stones tall and 10 to 30 stones in circumference, but their material and placement. Quartz, unlike local basalt or andesite, is often a conspicuous choice. It refracts light, it can shimmer in certain angles, and in many traditions across the world it bears symbolic charges connected to memory, boundary, and cosmology. The dating evidence here is maddeningly indirect. Cairns themselves lack organic material to radiocarbon, and quartz does not yield easy archaeometric signatures. Instead, researchers have relied on associated deposits, hearth charcoal in nearby shelters, lichenometric estimates of surface exposure, and occasional charred twigs found under cairn stones. These proxies cluster to suggest episodic activity from roughly 1,500 to 700 years before present, a window that overlaps with other intensifications of regional ritual activity but that also leaves a great deal of latitude for interpretation. When archaeologists excavated near some cairns, they found flakes of work stone and small caches of bone beads, along with occasional fragments of woven fiber preserved against sheltered rock surfaces. The presence of artifacts that echo coastal styles in some high-elevation cairn clusters hints at mobility and symbolic travel, people carrying objects, memories, and meanings uphill where the air is thin and the trees sigh differently. One persuasive theory treats the quartz cairns as boundary markers in a landscape of contested resources, lines of demarcation for hunting territories or shared seasonal pastures. In a topographically complex environment, Visible white stones on a ridge could serve as weatherproof markers for the movement of people and animals. Another interpretation reads the cairns as memory devices, small monuments set to mark events, sacrifices, or treaty sites. Across many cultures, cairns are mnemonic anchors for stories. They stand where words might fade. A third, more evocative hypothesis sees the quartz itself as essential to the act. Gatherings staged around a shimmering stone might enact cosmological performatives, attracting attention and conveying status. The sparkle draws the eye as liturgical smoke draws the nose. The materiality is part of the message. But here's where it gets tricky. Meteorological processes and animal behavior can move stones and create pseudomounds. Marmots, rodents, even elk rutting can displace rocks, and heavy winter avalanches can concentrate light-colored stones in exposed gullies. Geomorphologists caution against overeating ephemeral surface features. Yet the regularity of some clusters, their recurrence on culturally significant ridgelines, and their association with culturally diagnostic artifacts argue for human agency. Then there are the stories. Elders in valley communities tell of mountain lights and of cairns that sing when the moon is right, of tossing stones to mark the grief after an avalanche, and of travelers laying down a piece of quartz to pay a toll to the ridge spirits. The language here is thick with metaphor, but metaphor in oral tradition often encodes real practices. Imagine finding yourself at dusk on a ridge, the last light striking a little pile of milky quartz and making it look like a cluster of pale teeth against the dark. Imagine a small group gathered there, voices low, offering a calculated handful of food or a bead, perhaps in recognition of an oath, a treaty, or a mourning. Picture children pulling at each other's sleeves, the elders reciting a chant that names the cairn and the event it remembers. There is an intimacy in that scene that raw data cannot fully capture. Still, for all the vibrancy of ethnography and the suggestive clustering of artifacts, we cannot conclusively say whether the cairns were primarily boundary stones, mnemonic monuments, sanctuaries for small-scale ritual, or some blend of these. We still don't know whether the quartz was chosen for its optical properties, its transported exoticness, or its affordance as a durable, visible marker in a landscape where green can swallow weaker signs. That irresolution keeps the ridgelines alive in the mind. Not far from where the quartz sleeps, but in a different register of wonder, is the zone of drowned forests and shifting shorelines that line much of the Pacific edge. These are places where sea level change and coastal processes have buried and exhumed human artifacts on a scale that complicates our tidy narratives of occupation. The teaser is that drowned forests preserve palimpsests of human life, and their stratigraphy challenges simple models of coastal settlement and abandonment. Across the broader Northwest, submerged tree stumps and peat-encased logs show that sea levels and tidal dynamics have shifted repeatedly over millennia. In some estuaries, older shorelines lie now tens of meters offshore, their pottery shards and stone tools trapped in anaerobic sediments. Radiocarbon dates on wood in such contexts sometimes give ages as old as 5,000 to 6,000 years before present, placing human coastal occupation in a much older frame than the late Holocene emphases of some earlier models. The archaeological consequence is staggering. If reliable traces of coastal life are now underwater, our terrestrial survey methods may be sampling only the last chapters, missing earlier volumes of occupation written at different sea stands. Excavations of exposed peat on retreating shorelines have revealed hearths, faunal remains, and stone tools with typologies dating to early Holocene periods, points and blades earlier than the regional settlement intensification models predict. More provocative still are sediment cores showing abrupt layers of tsunami deposition tied to seismic events that can, in a single episode, shift a landscape from habitable shoreline to tidal grave. These events might explain sudden shifts in occupation patterning recorded in the terrestrial archaeology. Places once occupied for centuries suddenly abandoned or reconfigured after a single catastrophic inundation. The competing theories here straddle geology and social response. One line of argument emphasizes the dynamic nature of the coastline and posits that human groups adapted continuously, tracking shorelines as resources and shelters shifted. Another posits that catastrophic events, megathrust earthquakes and resultant tsunamis, forced rapid social reorganization, migration, and perhaps the remote transportation of people and goods inland. Some narratives suggest a cycle of adaptation and displacement. Communities moved, intermarried, and formed new alliances as the sea claimed old living spaces. Mythic accounts are poignant, stories of the long wave and nights when the stars fell into the water are preserved in songs, sometimes encoded as moral tales about hubris and the power of nature. Imagine standing on a low, reclaimed beach where the stumps of an ancient forest poke from the sand like knuckles, and thinking of the people who once dined where the surf now bites. Picture a hearthstone, smoothed by hands and now half buried in peat, its presence a quiet indictment of our assumptions about continuity. In the scientific voice, the evidence is demanding, we must integrate paleoseismic data, sea level curves, and submerged archaeology to fully understand human responses. But the record is patchy. Underwater archaeology is expensive and technically demanding, and much remains untested. We still don't know how many chapters of coastal life have been submerged beyond our current reach, how seismic events restructured social life on very short timescales, or how deeply contemporary oral traditions preserve memory of such disruptions. That uncertainty should make us humble. The shore is not merely a line we can draw on a map. It is an archive whose pages are periodically torn out by the elements. Moving from shore to inland riverine corridors, there is a different set of puzzles, engineered earthworks and modified channels that hint at deliberate hydrological management in pre-contact times. Survey teams mapping floodplains and terrace systems have documented linear berms, small dam-like structures, and channel realignments that, in aggregate, suggest people here were not passive users of waterways but active shapers. Some of these features align closely with fish run timing and spawning grounds. In one river system, a chain of small weir structures appears to have directed fish into corrals at specific points along a slow-moving bend, concentrating returns and allowing for communal capture without lethal mass entrapment. Radiocarbon dating on charred camas bulbs found in associated storage pits suggests these features were in active use between 1 and 2,000 years ago. The interpretation that these features represent sophisticated resource management is compelling because it aligns with ethnographic records of highly seasonal and calorically intensive fishing practices among coastal and riverine peoples. The debate emerges in scale and intent. Were these ad hoc, opportunistic manipulations of the landscape designed for yearly surpluses, or were they part of broader, institutionalized systems of resource control that imply more centralized social structures? Some archaeologists argue for gradual intensification. Rising population pressures and stable food returns encouraged investment in engineering to maximize returns. Others warn against teleology, assuming that such investments necessarily imply hierarchy, and emphasize that complex management can be embedded in relatively egalitarian social systems through ritualized labor-sharing obligations. Also, the interplay of climate cycles matters. An oscillation toward wetter or drier decades could make engineered systems temporarily far more valuable and worth the labor. Imagine standing near a little stone set across a channel, imagining hands lifting and setting rocks to alter the flow by inches, watching how fish concentrate where water eddies into a narrowing. Imagine the rhythmic communal labor of repair after winter floods, the songs sung into the spray as elders read the current and children learn where to step. The moral weight of these images is substantial. They show a people intimately attuned to their environment and active in shaping it. Yet, we still don't know whether these hydrological features reflect localized innovation, coordinated regional management strategies, seasonal congregation points for harvest, or responses to short-term climatic perturbations that demanded repeated infrastructure investments. The uncertainties point again to a theme. Tangible modifications of landscape are suggestive but not determinative of social organization. Only by combining engineering analysis, paleo-environmental reconstruction, and oral histories can we hope to approach a fuller understanding. Each of these segments, the quartz cairns, the drowned forests, the engineered rivers, refuses tidy reduction. They push us to reckon with the idea that human beings across time held complex, variable relationships with their environments, with each other, and with the unseen forces that govern survival. Some practices make immediate practical sense. Modifying a river to catch fish, marking a boundary to prevent conflict. Others suggest meanings encoded in material choices, placing quartz on a ridge to catch the light or building a small stone pile that remembers a treaty. And all of them live on multiple registers at once: practical, social, symbolic, and mythic. If there is a through line across these sites, it is this: people did not simply live in Oregon's varied geographies. They continuously remade them, sometimes in ways that left durable traces and sometimes in ways that the sea or the forest later erased. That fragility is part of the melancholy and the thrill. We still don't know the full scale or sequence of these interventions, how many rhythms of life are now invisible beneath water or moss, or which of our narratives will hold as new techniques recover hidden pages. We have walked together over stones that refuse a single explanation and through peat that keeps time in black rings, and as we step back from each site, the coastal rows, the sunken plateau houses, the burial flats, the carved canyon, the trading stone, the watching circle, the quartz cairns, the drowned forests, and the shaped rivers, a pattern emerges not of tidy answers but of human kinds of intelligence repeated in different registers, the intelligence that marks a path for the fog-bound traveler, the intelligence that rearranges a hillside to hold more people, the intelligence that treats a shore as both boundary and home, the intelligence that inscribes the sky into stone, the intelligence that gathers strangers at a bench to exchange more than goods, the intelligence that holds time in a ring of watching stones, the intelligence that chooses a spectacular mineral to speak memory on the ridge, the intelligence that reads floodplain and sea level with a kind of engineering poetry. These are not single acts but habits of mind and body, to make a place legible, to make it hold food, to make it speak cosmology, to make it hold grief. Still, for all the recurring themes, the particularities matter. In one valley, the reason for a post's girth may be seasonal, a need to hoist more stored bulbs during lean years. In another, a line of stones may be less a boundary than a ritualized choreography to bind people together after a disaster. The devil, or the marvel, is in those particulars, and our desire for clean narratives will always be tempered by the messy generosity of human lives. We have learned to use many tools in our attempt to listen: radiocarbon that gives us numbers that are maddeningly precise and maddeningly provisional, dendrochronology that lets us read the pulses of climate like a heartbeat, isotopes that whisper about childhood geologies, obsidian sourcing that maps human routes better than any modern road, soil micromorphology that reveals repeated feet and hearths in the microscopic sediments of a living floor. But here is an honest astonishment. The most important data sometimes arrive in the soft voice of an elder, the slipped phrase in an oral tale that names a place's sorrow or shame or pride, the way a community keeps a memory alive in song or silence. Science is not diminished by such testimonies, rather, it is sharpened. When a story recalls a long wave, or a shaking that swallowed houses, and when geologists find evidence of a tsunami horizon dated to the same period, we get a richer, more humane picture than either source could produce alone. Now, let's be fair, the seduction of the sensational, giants, lost tribes that crossed oceans in improbable craft, or dark cults that turned graves into theaters, can distract from the quieter, more consequential insights. Sometimes the mythic elements are poetic metaphors, giants as a way to name elder ancestors of imposing moral reach, lost tribes as an elegy for people who were displaced and whose descendants still live with that loss. Other times myth preserves kernel facts in allegory. We must neither rule out the possible nor accept the fantastic without rigorous testing. That is the balanced skepticism and wonder we owe these places. Across all these sites, mobility appears as both a fact and a metaphor. People move to track salmon and camas, to visit seasonal rendezvous, to marry across valleys, to negotiate regions of resource abundance and scarcity. Exchange shows up not only in beads and obsidian but in the very grammar of stone. The same forms recur across rivers because people learn, borrow, and teach. Landscape engineering reappears as evidence that pre-contact societies here were active agents in shaping environments to their needs, building weirs and channels that require a communal sense of labor and a shared ethic of stewardship. And the sea, relentless and patient, moves along its own timetable, sometimes erasing whole chapters of human occupation so that our maps are always incomplete. That incompleteness is not tragic in itself, it is the condition of history. But it should humble us. The thrill of discovery ought to be tempered by the responsibility of care, to descendants, to the living ecosystems that host these traces, and to the integrity of scientific practice. Where bones lie, where sacred stones are spoken of in whispered tones, archaeologists and storytellers alike must yield to protocols informed by the communities whose ancestors built and loved these places. Reburial and stewardship are not obstacles to knowledge, they are ethical priorities that shape what knowledge we are allowed to gather. And there is another lesson, quieter but no less profound. The human impulse to mark meaning in the world is a constant across time. We place stones, we stack light minerals on ridges to catch the eye, we carve grooves into rock to remember stars, we build houses with care so our children have a floor under their sleeping bodies. The marks we leave are both functional, so many of the engineered river features attest, and performative, ritual and law are enacted in material form. The forms that persist best are those that strike the right balance between utility and symbol. A weir that reliably catches fish is useful in both senses. It feeds bodies and it codifies a pattern of cooperation. A stone line that helps a traveler does not merely direct feet, it signals to an entire community that the path is cared for. That doubleness, practical and symbolic at once, is why we find it so difficult to offer single-purpose explanations. Human acts are rarely one-dimensional. If you take away anything from what we have read into these places, let it be this. These are not curiosities tucked away in an archive of error, nor are they mere ornaments for sensational TV. They are living traces of human life, experiments in social organization, attempts to hold the future with food planning, gestures of memory, ways of making a world that would support more than one generation. The stone rows taught their people how to move by night. The sunken houses taught how to withstand climate and conflict. The burial flats taught us how mobility and mourning intersect in ways that no single isotopic signature can fully reveal. The petroglyphs taught us the value of sky and stone in the making of calendars and cosmology. The trading stone taught us the depth of networks that knit inland and coast. The watching circle taught us how social law and star sighting could cohabit a place. The cairns taught us that an ordinary mineral can be an extraordinary memory device. The drowned forests taught us humility at the scale of geological power. The engineered rivers taught us that stewardship and industry can be ancient and local, not merely modern and industrial. All of these lessons accumulate into a single, human story, one of adaptation, of imagination, of exchange, of grief, and of the stubborn desire to make tomorrow possible. So what now? We do not need certainty to act. We need curiosity sharpened by method and tenderness shaped by respect. Preservation matters. Each bulldozed bench, each unregulated shoreline development, and each ill-timed excavation not cleared with descendant input can erase the delicate context that holds meaning. Support for underwater archaeology, community-led stewardship programs, and interdisciplinary research that centers oral histories are all urgent. But beyond funding and policy there is a personal responsibility each of us can carry, to listen when elders speak, to resist the headline's appetite for spectacle, to prefer close reading to boundaryless speculation, to walk softly on ridges and shorelines with the sense that we are not the first to be astonished here. That humility will keep us from turning nuance into noise and mystery into caricature. And yet, even as we call for rigor and care, we must not lose the capacity to imagine. The imagination is the very engine of archaeology. It supplies the hypotheses we then test. Picture again the procession between stones, the communal labor on a high plateau reconstructing life after a violent shaking, the bench where trade and song exchanged hands, the rock panel marking the solstice that guided planting. These are not just pleasant images, they are methodological tools. By conjuring plausible human scenes we generate testable predictions. If a procession occurred here, we might expect where patterns or paired hearths. If trade occurred on the bench, we might expect a concentration of non-local material. If a tsunami reshaped a shore, we should find a sand layer capped by peat. In that sense, imagination married to measurement is the most powerful engine we own. And finally, in a more personal register, These places remind us that our story is not only a succession of technological improvements and ever finer instruments. It is also a story of how people found ways to make meaning in a world that could be cruel and beautiful in equal measure. Sometimes a cairn is a piece of memory, sometimes a circle is law, sometimes a stone line is a hand held in the dark. These acts are small defiance against time and tide. We tell them to keep them alive, and we tell them because in them we find a mirror. The same questions that moved our ancestors also move us. How do we feed who comes after us? How do we remember what matters? How do we grieve without being undone? In seeking answers, we practice a kind of kinship across centuries. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.